Okay, so hey there guys. So today's video is going to be quite an exciting one. I'm really quite an exciting one. I am super excited to film this video. I kind of came up with this idea 2 days ago and I was like, I really want to film that. So today's video is going to be palettes I almost bought but didn't. Basically, something in me told me that I didn't need these palettes in my collection. And I have about 20 palettes on this list. So if I didn't say no to these palettes, I would have probably over 80 or 90 palettes in my collection. And that is just way too much. I already have way too many palettes to begin with. So, like I actually filmed a video on all of my palettes yesterday. So you will see that video very, very soon. But today I have a full list of palettes that I think that I was better off not purchasing, and I'm really, really excited to film this video. So, the first brand that I really, really wanted to cover is Anastasia Beverly Hills. Now, I have only purchased the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette. I have not purchased any other Anastasia palette since she's been releasing them after the Modern Renaissance palette, because the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette was the first permanent palette for Anastasia Beverly Hills. I was first starting to get into the brand when I first purchased the Modern Renaissance palette. I think that was one of my first purchases from her. I don't know if I had purchased the glow kits before the Modern Renaissance palette, but I wasn't really into the brand before that because I kind of had, I just thought her products were too expensive. I thought her products were too popular for no reason. I just didn't want to jump on the Anastasia bandwagon, and then I kind of got sucked in, and now I really, really like her products a lot. I don't absolutely love her products. I love her glosses and her highlights. I think her highlights are amazing. I don't love her lipsticks. Her eyeshadows are really good though, and the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette had the same formula that her single shadows did. That's how I felt anyway, especially when I first got it. I feel that she has changed too much formula-wise with the rest of her palettes from what I've just heard from other people that have made constant videos about her palettes, that I kind of have had no interest in picking up any other palettes from her. And I'll insert a clip of all the palettes here. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to pull them up real quick. I'm just going to go to the Anastasia website. So she has released a handful of palettes since the Modern Renaissance palette. And I really want to cover the whole subculture debacle, not like the whole thing that happened. I just want to cover the palette and why I didn't have any interest in picking up any of these palettes. So, I've been kind of thinking about replacing my Modern Renaissance palette, and I feel like that's the only reason why I would decide to even purchase another Anastasia palette, because I feel like my Modern Renaissance palette is kind of getting very old, and kind of the formula is just not performing the same as it used to. So I really want to talk about her eyeshadow palettes, and most of them are on her website, so we're just going to cover all of these. So the first one I wanted to get into is the Anastasia Subculture palette. So this is the first palette I wanted to cover. So this is what it looks like. I think everyone knows what this palette looks like, so I'm not really going to show a close-up. I just wanted to show you guys really quick what the palette looks like. So the reason why I, kind of thought that this palette was going to be a really interesting addition to my collection. I thought it was very unique, and then I heard so many bad things about the palette, and every time I'm at TJ Maxx or Marshalls now, I see it everywhere, and I'm always tempted to pick it up. But then I'm just like, I'm not going to wear these colors enough in order for me to purchase this. And that's why I have pretty much convinced myself that I don't need it every single time I see it or every single time I'm thinking about getting it. So I have just decided to pass on it every single time. The colors are beautiful, but again, there are too many mattes in this palette for me and not enough lid shades. There's not enough variety. Yes, the color story is gorgeous and it's a very unique color story. No one else has really done this color story, but there's only 3 metallic shades. There's only Adorn, Electric, and Cube. All the rest of them are all mattes. And since everyone was saying that the palette was very, very powdery, but I have seen from my two YouTube friends from Exo Marley and Chippo, Moment with Chip, they both love this palette. So that would be the only reason why I would decide to pick up this palette. But again, I don't wear color enough. Yes, I have been wearing colorful eyeshadow looks in my past two videos, yesterday and today, but I had a lot of time to film before a class today. I was supposed to go to the club, but I just didn't make it. So that is the first palette that I convinced myself I didn't need. Now let's go through the rest of the Anastasia palette. So the next one I believe that was released was the Anastasia Soft Glam palette. Now, I knew right away I was not going to get this palette because it is a beautiful palette. Like, it is a really beautiful neutral palette, and I feel like this is probably the one I would gravitate towards the most to replace my Modern Renaissance palette. Like, I'm kind of really interested in this palette. But the reason why I would not purchase this palette is because there are way too many repeat shades in this palette that were in the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette and are Anastasia singles. Now, the main reason why that I saw people were picking up this palette was because it was a really travel-friendly palette because it has a lot of Anastasia's staple shades that they would use in their collection from their singles. For me, I don't need that. I have Sienna in a single. I have Burnt Orange in the Modern Renaissance palette. Also, Cypress Umber and Tempera are in the Modern Renaissance palette. But I was thinking about getting this to replace that palette because I don't use that palette anymore, and it would be nice to have these shades again in another palette. So this would probably be the only palette I would be interested in getting. I've also Orange Soda and Dusty Rose are both single shadows, and I believe they both have been in palettes before, but I've never owned those two shadows. All the rest of them, honestly, there's a really, really nice variety of lid shades in this palette. I'm kind of convincing myself to pick this up at some point. This would be the one palette that I would want to replace my Modern Renaissance palette with because I don't use my Modern Renaissance palette anymore. So as I'm looking at it, there's like 5 lid shades in here that look beautiful. And there's a lot of really great staple mattes that I would use. So before, I used to pass over this palette saying I don't need it because I have the Modern Renaissance palette and I have these in singles. But since the only single that I really do own in this palette is Sienna, and if I decide not to use my Modern Renaissance palette anymore and pick this up at some point, I might pick this up. People have been saying they've been finding this at Marshall's, so if I find this at Marshall's, I might pick it up if it's like $20. I'm not going to pick it up for full price though, but if I find it at Marshall's, I think I might get it. So I guess I just convinced myself to get it, so... But yeah, not for a while because I just got a new palette yesterday that I haven't tested out yet, so I wouldn't get it for a while. So then the next Anastasia palette was the Anastasia Norvina eyeshadow palette. And I am not a fan of Norvina as a person. I don't think she's the nicest person, to be honest. There was a lot of controversy about her when the Subculture palette was released. She was kind of shutting down a lot of people about the formula and was saying, you're wrong, the formula is amazing. She was kind of being really sketchy about the whole situation. That kind of just turned me off from the whole Subculture thing anyway. I was just like, I don't need to waste my money on something when someone is not really being honest. I don't even know how she still is running the company, to be honest, because of that whole thing. But, you know, Too Faced got away with it with the peach palette, so I guess Norvina can get away with it too. And I still purchase Anastasia products. I mean, I haven't gotten an Anastasia product for, I think, about a year. I haven't actually went out and purchased an Anastasia product in about a year. I think the last one I actually got was the Anastasia matte lipstick in Peachy. I don't think I've gotten anything else from her in a long time. So I guess I've been on a no-buy from her for a year and I didn't even realize, like, I didn't even pay for this gloss that I'm wearing. But anyway, this is the Norvina palette. And I thought it was really pretty at first. And yes, it is a... Oh. Didn't need to see that reminder. It is a beautiful palette, but honestly, like she called it the purple palette, but honestly, there's only about 3 purple shades in this whole palette. If you kind of take out the purples, it's pretty much a neutral palette. And I do like that you get a lot more of a variety of shimmer shades in this palette though, like in the top row and in the bottom row you have all matte. So I can appreciate that they did finally put some more shimmer shades in their palettes over the past couple of palettes that they've released. So this one has the same packaging as the Soft Glam and Subculture and Modern Renaissance did. But I just would not support Norvina personally, so I would never pick up this palette. I was totally just interested in this palette when it came out. It just, like, their palettes have not interested me in a while, so, and I'm just, like, convincing myself every time they come out with a palette that I don't really need it, so, but, I just think that if you take out Soul, Celestial, and Drama, it's not really a purple palette. There's a lot of pinks in this palette, like Rose Gold, Wild Child, and Love. And then you have standard mattes like Volatile, Eccentric, and Passion. Dreamer's a beautiful shade, but other than that, I don't really need this palette because, again, I don't find myself using this every single day. It is very pretty and it's tempting, and it's a pretty color scheme, but I just would not get it because I'm not a collector of Anastasia's palettes, so... And even if I was, I probably wouldn't even pick up half of these palettes because I just know I wouldn't really use them. So the last palette I want to cover and the most recent release, this was their holiday release and it is still available on their website. I thought it would be a limited edition palette, but it's still available, and obviously I'm talking about the Anastasia Sultry palette. So this is what the palette looks like. Now, out of all the palettes that I had talked about, this was the one that I was the most interested in to pick up at some point to replace my Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette. But now, since I'm convincing myself that I think that the Soft Glam would be the most practical to replace my Modern Renaissance palette, I would much rather pick up that one than this one. I'm not a huge fan of cool tone matte shades. I'm a very warm toned matte girl. I love warm toned mattes. They're just my favorite. The crease shades and the matte shades in here are really beautiful, but there's only a few. You only get a brow bone highlight in Fresh. Twig is a beautiful shade. Dystopian's beautiful outer corner shade, and Birch, but then the rest of them are very cool tone, like Slate and Noir. Bloom is just a random pop of red. I don't really know why that's in there. They basically say if you take out the Bloom shade, like if you take out this Bloom shade, the palette isn't probably half as appealing to you. Like, look when I take it out. Like, it's basically just a neutral palette if you take out that shade. So the more I looked at this, like, I have added this to my cart in Sephora.com like a couple of times, and I've been interested in picking it up, but every time I add it, I kind of just convince myself that I don't need it. I know that the lid shades are really beautiful in here, but again, and I probably would use this palette the most besides the Soft Glam because it is more neutral. But again, do I need another neutral palette like this? No, because I feel like the Soft Glam would be something more that I would gravitate towards. So I know I keep on mentioning it, but I'm probably going to pick it up at some point. But this is just a palette that I don't need. It is very beautiful and is appealing to me, and I was going to pick it up during the Christmas time, but then since me and Chip did our makeup swap and she picked up 3 palettes for me that I had to test out for that whole month, I was just like, I don't need any more palettes. I got enough palettes in November that's why I was on a no-buy from December on when I picked up the Natasha Denona Gold palette. I was on a no-buy for palettes in in January and February. Wow. I just received a new palette yesterday, so that's how long I've been on a no-buy from palettes, like at least 60-something days. So I think that's a pretty good amount of time to pick up a new palette. Not that I really needed a new palette, but I really wanted to try out this brand's eyeshadow. So that is it for Anastasia Beverly Hills. Oh, we have one more palette to talk about from Anastasia. and I just want to pull it up on Google because it's not available anymore, and I think you guys would know what palette I'm talking about. And this is the Anastasia Master by Mario palette. This would have been the only palette I would have been remotely interested in getting from Anastasia Beverly Hills after the Modern Renaissance palette was released. Oh, I'm forgetting about the Prism palette too. Whoopsie. I guess we should cover both of those real quick. But I wanted to cover Anastasia palettes as a brand because they were definitely the palettes I was the most interested in buying every time she would release a palette, so I really wanted to talk about all of them. So this palette honestly would have been a really great staple in my collection. I probably would have used this palette like crazy. I probably would have hit pan on a couple of shades like I did in the Modern Renaissance palette finally. But the only reason why I was not able to pick up this palette is because I didn't really have money at the time when I was getting a holiday palette for, I think it was Christmas of 2016 when this was released, I believe. And the palette I decided to get was the Kat Von D Metal Matte palette. That was the palette I was the most interested in, and I skipped over quite a few other palettes because that was the palette I was definitely number one getting. I really, really wanted this palette, but by the time I had money to go get it, it was sold out everywhere. You couldn't even get it anymore, and I was like, I guess it's just not meant to be. But this would have been the only palette I would have been interested in to pick up, but it was the only limited edition palette that Anastasia has released since before the Modern Renaissance palette, because again, like I said, before the Modern Renaissance palette, all of her palettes were not permanent. The Modern Renaissance palette was such a huge hit because it was the first permanent palette from Anastasia. So, yeah, it kind of sucked that I didn't get that one. I would have loved to get that, but unfortunately, I wasn't able to. And then the last palette I want to cover from Anastasia Beverly Hills is the Prism palette, and this is what the palette looks like. This was the palette that I knew I was the least interested in with Anastasia Beverly Hills because I did not like the color scheme whatsoever. I just think these shades are kind of just thrown together, and I feel like none of them really go with each other. I know it's a very interesting color scheme and color story to put together, but I have had no interest in this palette. I'm just like, I don't really need it. Like, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I think 6 shimmer shades, and then the rest are all mattes, which I believe there are 7. There's like a random yellow in it called Sphere. Actually, I think there's 7 shimmers and 6 mattes. There's Lure, which is like a random dusty mauve shade. We have a black, which is called Obsidian. Unity, which is a really nice crease shade. Like a Transition. Parallel, which is a soft brown. Well, a dark brown. And then Eden, which is like a soft peach. And then Saturn, which is a darker orangey shade. It's just like, it doesn't really make sense to me. Like, I wouldn't pair like probably any of these colors together. So this palette I always thought was pretty random, and I think this was their holiday palette before Sultry. It was the year before that. I think it was December 2017. And I was just like, I don't need this. Like, I had no interest in picking up this palette. So that palette was easy for me to skip over. So that is it from Anastasia Beverly Hills. Now let's talk about Urban Decay because I really want to talk about Urban Decay next. So we're going to pull up a couple of Urban Decay palettes. I only have 3 to talk about. Okay, so the first palette is the Urban Decay Naked Smoky palette. I did actually pick up this palette originally. Oh, if I could pull up a better picture, which it's not letting me zoom in. But I think a lot of people know what this palette looks like. So that is the Urban Decay Naked Smoky palette. Basically, it's a palette full of smoky tone shades so you can create a smoky look. And that's basically what the Naked Heat was playing off of, is that They were kind of doing like a warm palette and a cool tone palette, meaning a smoky palette and then a warm tone palette. So I obviously got the Naked Heat palette, but I did originally purchase this, and I believe I hauled it back in my channel like at least 2 years ago. And I think I just returned it because I wanted the money at the time because I felt like I had spent too much money in makeup. And I had used it a couple of times, and every time I used it, I wasn't really that thrilled with it. So I ended up returning it and never repurchasing it again. I was kind of interested in repurchasing the palette when Ulta or Urban Decay would run a promotion on it because it's back to full price for some reason. I don't know why it's back to full price, but this palette is always on promo, and I believe you can find it at Nordstrom Rack or Marshall's. I think you can find it at Nordstrom Rack for half price usually. So why would you pay full price for it on Ulta's website or Urban Decay? It just was kind of a boring palette to me. Like, I kind of felt like the looks that I was creating with it didn't really wow me because I'm not really a huge cool tone fan. Sorry, my nose is itching me like crazy on the inside. Sorry. The packaging was stunning. I loved the outer packaging, but other than that, I wasn't really thrilled with it. There's only like 5 matte shades in here, and then the rest of them are all very dark shades. I feel like there's actually only 3 shimmers in this palette, and then there's a ton of matte shades. So I feel like in this palette, they had too many mattes. Like, they went from having like not too many mattes at all to way too many mattes in this palette. Because it looks like, from what I can see, there's only about 5, actually there's like 6 shimmer shades, or 7, and then there's about, because when I actually close up, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mattes, and the rest are shimmers. So it is a very pretty palette, but again, it was nothing that really wowed me, so I didn't really need it in my collection. So speaking of the Naked palettes, let's talk about the Urban Decay Naked Reloaded palette. So this is their most recent release of the Naked palettes, and obviously, if you guys have been living under a rock, you guys know that, or didn't know that Urban Decay did recently discontinue the original Urban Decay palette. A lot of people were very upset that Urban Decay was discontinuing the palette, but this is basically like their remixed version, reloaded version of the Urban Decay original Naked palette. So this is the Reloaded palette. And I did talk about this briefly in my recent Makeup and Chill Fridays about the Urban Decay Naked Reloaded palette. When I had used my Naked palette in that video, I went back to using my Naked palette, and I've actually been going back to use my Naked palettes recently, and I've used quite a few of them over the past week or so. The only one that I haven't used yet is the Naked 3, but I've used the first 2, Naked Heat and Naked Cherry, recently, and I just don't really understand the color scheme in this palette. I kind of feel like Urban Decay is kind of like fallen off the radar a little bit, or a little bit off the mark with a little bit off the mark would be a better way to say it, right? Of their color schemes lately. I feel like the Cherry palette was a better color scheme, but like I said a million times, why did they call it the Cherry palette? They should have called it the Naked Berries palette. It would have made a lot more sense. But looking at this, I was just totally uninterested in this palette, and so many people were comparing this palette to the Anastasia Sultry palette. And then I was kind of thinking, like, since I convinced myself already to not get the Sultry palette, I pretty much could convince myself to not get this one either. That I was totally uninterested in getting it. I've been hearing very mixed reviews about it, though. Yes, it is a very pretty neutral palette, but again, I just don't need another neutral palette. I'd rather try other brands besides Urban Decay. I have enough Urban Decay palettes in my collection. I have 5 Naked palettes. I have the Moon Dust, I have the After Dark, I have the Alice Through the Looking Glass, I have the Electric palette. Like, I have almost 10. I have the Naked Basics palette. I have like 10 Urban Decay palettes in my collection that I didn't really need to add another one that I would just use another neutral palette. Like, I just didn't need it. Like, I didn't think it was as good or original as the original Naked palette. Yes, there are more mattes in here, but again, there's not too many mattes. There's only 4 or 5, I believe. Blur is not really a matte. You have Bucked, which is like an updated version of Buck. Endgame, which is a brown, like an outer corner shade. Retro, which is another coral. And Bribe, which is a brow bone highlight. And then basically the rest of them are shimmers. And Boundaries, which is a nice crease shade as well. Sorry I missed that one. But again, totally uninterested. Was so easy for me to skip over that palette. So the last Urban Decay palette I wanted to talk about is the Urban Decay Elements palette. And I did actually receive this palette from Chip when she sent me her resend of her Urban Decay, of her holiday package that I had sent her. So this is the Urban Decay Elements palette. So this is what it looks like. And this was probably the palette I was the most interested in from Urban Decay over the past year or so. I thought it looked stunning, but again, I just kind of talked myself out of getting this palette because I didn't really need it, because I knew that I wasn't going to be able to use this palette enough in order for me to justify purchasing it. I mean, I didn't even purchase it the first time, but I kind of just convinced myself that I didn't need it. I wanted to keep the Makeup Forever glitters that I received from her, which I'm actually wearing one of them on my lid today. I actually wore this on my lid in my products I used up in 2018 video, in my New Year's video that I posted on New Year's Eve. I was wearing this on my lid, but I have not really worn it since then, so I was like, maybe I should wear it again. So I used it in my Get Ready With Me for Frozen, but I haven't worn it all over my lid in a while, and it's so stunning, so I was like, I need to use it today. So, but I was having a lot more fun with those Makeup Forever glitters, and I would use those more than this, that I was like, this is just too overwhelming for me. I don't need such a big, colorful, shimmery palette that I won't use half as much. And I know that Chip loved this when I sent it to her, so I definitely know that she's going to get a lot more use out of it than me. So those were the 3 Urban Decay palettes that I wanted to cover. Now let's talk about Natasha Denona. So I just want to pull up one palette from Natasha Denona. And we're talking about the Natasha Denona Sunset palette. So let's just show you guys what that looks like real quick. So this is the Natasha Denona Sunset palette. Now, this was probably the palette that I was the most interested in on this entire list to get, because it looked like such a gorgeous, stunning palette to me. But I kept on convincing myself to not purchase it because, first of all, I wasn't really the biggest fan of Natasha Denona because of what she did to my girl, the Fancy Face. I love the Fancy Face. To this day, I've only really spent about 45 bucks on Natasha Denona. The other 2 products I have from her, I did not pay for. Actually, like 70 bucks, because I only paid $30 for the gold palette. But I felt like the gold palette was a little bit more unique to my collection than this one. Since I already have my Naked Heat palette and I use that so much, I just don't think I would utilize this palette enough. And plus, it's so damn expensive. It's $130. I'm just like, yes, it probably is more worth it than picking up like a Tom Ford palette for that price. And I've heard that like nothing but amazing things about her palettes, and especially this one. And it really does look beautiful, but when you actually take out like the orange, the red, and the yellow, again, it's pretty much a warm tone palette. Yes, it is something I probably would use quite a bit, but I also did hear if you don't use Natasha Denona palettes enough, they do go bad after a year or so. I can deal with that with Anastasia Beverly Hills because it's literally half the price of these palettes. That it didn't really bother me as much when my Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette went bad. I'm like, Renaissance. Which I'm kind of like really convincing myself to go get it after this video, because like, since I haven't touched my Modern Renaissance palette in like 3 months, I feel like that would be the best thing to replace it with. So I may be convincing myself to get it as I'm recording this video. But yeah, I just convinced myself that I didn't need this palette because I was not going to spend that much money. I was like, I'm going to get it when I have a gift card at some point. I almost wanted my boyfriend to pick this up for me last Christmas, but I think he purchased quite a few products from Sephora for me He got like a bunch of high-end stuff for me rather than getting one eyeshadow palette. I was like, I'm not going to use it enough, and I'd rather get like multiple items from Sephora for the same cost as one eyeshadow palette, because then I would only have like another $70 for him to spend on me, and I was just like, I'm just going to get multiple stuff. So, and then I was like, since they go bad very quickly, I was just like, I don't need this. So I decided to get the gold palette back in December because I returned the Elements palette and the Rihanna palette that Chip had sent to me, and I returned it back to my Sephora, so I got like an $100 store credit. So I put that towards the gold palette, and the gold palette only ended up costing me $30. So that was the only way I was ever going to try Natasha Denona palettes, is that I didn't really have to pay for it. So that is the only Natasha Denona palette I'm going to talk about. Now let's talk about Too Faced. I'm not really going to be talking about multiple palettes from them. You guys know how I feel about the brand, but I definitely want to cover this palette in this video because this was definitely the one palette I was the most interested in. And obviously I'm talking about their most recent Christmas released palette, and this is the Too Faced Gingerbread palette. I don't know why this says damaged. Oh, that's not a very good picture. That's a better one. So this is from Too Faced official website. So this palette, I feel like I wanted to make a whole dedicated video just on this freaking palette, ranting about it, because what I don't understand is no one literally mentioned this palette after it was sold out. Nobody. It like dropped off the face of the earth right after it was sold out everywhere. Like, they released it in, I believe, October or November. They had it out for until about the second week of December, and then it was gone from existence for forever. You could not get it on the Too Faced website. They did not restock it at all. They did say when they released this palette, it was limited edition. Maybe they finally learned their lesson from the Peach palette, that when they said that was limited edition, they brought it back. So maybe they actually made this limited edition and listened to their customers, because people were getting real fed up with them bringing back palettes that weren't limited edition, apparently, because they brought them back like a year later. So the thing that annoys me the most about this palette is that, yes, it was limited edition, but you couldn't find it anywhere when it was gone. And yes, I understand it was sold out, but it was sold out everywhere. Everybody wanted it, and by the time I wanted to get it, it was gone. And I just think they kind of handled it really poorly. They knew that it was a super in-demand palette, that they should have restocked it at least one more time before Christmas, because they knew that probably some people would have wanted to purchase it in the middle of December. For the people that don't really know what to get somebody until they see something like this, maybe they didn't know about it. Like, I know that Too Faced doesn't have to cater to these people. And yes, it was limited edition, so maybe my argument is totally falling on flat ears, but I just don't think that I think most companies do understand when they release a Christmas palette, they usually do restock it before Christmas. That usually is what happens with every single company. And Too Faced has done that in the past. They have restocked Christmas palettes right before Christmas. But for some reason with this one, they were not bothered. They were like, once it's sold out, it's gone. And I totally understand that, but I was interested in getting it, and that was the only Too Faced palette I really was interested in getting. Since like the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette, because after they released that palette, I wasn't really interested in any of their palettes anymore. I also really wanted to get the Too Faced Christmas palette from 2017, when I wanted to get all those Christmas palettes, like the last palette that I'm going to mention that came out during Christmas that year. But I'm starting to get like a little bit tired of talking. But I decided I also convinced myself to not get that palette either, because I already have one of the Too Faced limited edition Christmas palettes, and I don't even use that until Christmas usually, and I only use it about 3 times a year in December. That I was like, I really don't need another Too Faced palette that I'm not going to use, and I'm just going to get it for collector's purposes. I'm like, I don't need it. So that is it about Too Faced. Now let's talk about this palette. And the next palette I wanted to talk about is the Lorac Mega Pro 3 palette. Now, this was, again, when I couldn't really afford, wow, looking at this palette now, it really uninspires me because it's so matte. Unless I just can't really see the pictures that properly. Wow, this is not loading properly. Okay, so this is the first picture that I found on Nordstrom. So this is the Lorac Mega Pro 3. Now, I wanted to get this palette because I really wanted to try and love Lorac eyeshadows, because when I had purchased the original Lorac Pro palette, I wasn't really too impressed with it. I never really fell in love with it like most people did. Basically, the Lorac Pro palette was people's holy grail palette besides the Naked palette. It came out around the same time. I think it came out a little bit later than the Naked palette. I'm not exactly sure, but that is basically the biggest staple palette in people's collection besides like the Too Faced chocolate bar. That's like the other palette that people like have. And I own all 3 palettes myself, but I never use the Lorac Pro palette anymore. So now I am not regretting not getting this at all. But also, this palette was released around that time where I couldn't afford more than one eyeshadow palette when I got the Kat Von D one, and then I decided to get the Urban Decay After Dark palette right after that. So those were the 2 holiday palettes I decided to get over these ones. And looking at this palette now, honestly, this would have totally uninspired me. Why is this so hard to zoom into this? The color scheme, honestly, isn't really that great. There are a ton of matte shades in here, but like the lit shades don't really make sense to me. Yes, you can create a lot of looks out of it, but again, I just feel like if I had this palette in my collection, I don't need 32 shades. Yeah, 32 shades in a palette. It's just overwhelming to me. And I just feel like that this palette's a little bit boring. It's kind of uninspiring when I look at it. So I'm just like, I'm good. I'm glad that I didn't get this palette. So I've never been really interested in the Lorac Pro palettes because I don't need them. Like, they're just too big. And I think the only other one I was kind of interested in was the 4, which was the pink one. And I just want to cover that one super quickly. But again, the random green in the palette just really, really throws me off. It's just like, what is the point of that? They're just, again, like, kind of boring to me. Like, the color schemes, like, this looks like an Easter egg, but, like, the green kind of looks like it was just thrown in there, and you'd think that this would be more of a pinky tone palette, but there's literally only one pink matte in here. And there's, again, like, too many random colors in there. It's, like, too dark for me, so I'm just like, I'm good. I don't really have any interest in the Lorac Mega Pro palettes. Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more palettes to cover. So let's just talk about these really, really quick. So we're just going to talk about Lime Crime super quick. So I am actually wearing the Lime Crime Venus 2 palette today in my crease. All the mattes that I used today were from the Lime Crime Venus 2 palette. So I wanted to cover the Lime Crime Venus XL palette first. So you guys know I freaking love the Venus XL palette. So this is the, can I get a better picture? So this is the sister palette to it. So this is the Lime Crime Venus XL 2 palette. This is the outer packaging. And then this is the inside of the palette. And the Venus XL palette, I feel like that the colors go better together, so much better than this palette. I feel like there should have been probably more pinks and greens in this palette. I mean, the color scheme is not as bad as the Lorac one, and these colors do make sense together, but at the same time, it's just not a palette I would gravitate towards because I don't really need it. I already have 3 Lime Crime Venus palettes in my collection. I do love the Venus Lime Crime formula. I love Lime Crime's eyeshadows. They're amazing. But I just feel like I wouldn't need this palette. Maybe I'll pick it up in the spring because it is a really beautiful springtime palette. But again, I just don't think I would use it enough. I don't wear green enough to justify me picking up this palette. There's like 3 pink shades in here and like 5 greens. And then the rest of them are like warm toned crease shades. So it just doesn't really like sway me like as much as I would like it to. But again, it just kind of convinces me that I don't really need it. It is probably the palette I would be the most interested in getting besides the Soft Glam, but I think out of all these palettes that I'm talking about, that's the palette I want to get. So, it is really pretty when I see it swatched, and the green shades are stunning, but it's just not something I would wear enough to actually get it. So, the, other Lime Crime Venus palette I want to talk about is the Lime Crime Venus 3. And this was the 3rd palette that they released in the Venus line for the smaller palettes. So this is the Venus 3 palette. So that's what it looks like on the inside. And then this is the outer packaging. And again, it looks so pretty. It has some really beautiful lilac shades in here, but again, and the colors do go really nicely together, and that's what I love about the Venus palettes, is that they really do a great job of picking shades that really do go together. Like the Lime Crime Venus 2 might not be something that people think really goes together. I think that you can create so many looks out of it because it is a really great selection of shades, and the same thing with the Venus one. The Venus one is my favorite. But you have a beautiful matte purple in here, a beautiful matte pink, a beautiful dusty rose, a beautiful white for the brow bone. You have a beautiful purple shade and a gold, and like this taupey brown, and then you have a dark outer corner shade. So you can create multiple looks out of this palette, but again, there's only 2 purple shades in it. Like you would think it's a purple palette, but there's only 2 purple shades that I just don't need it because it's just something, again, that I wouldn't use enough. So I just kind of convinced myself I didn't need the 3 palette. Yes, I am a collector of the Venus palettes, but I just don't really need those. Like, they are very springy to me, and they're beautiful, but I don't need them. So, now let's talk about ColourPop. So, the one palette that I always wanted to get from ColourPop is the ColourPop Yes Please palette. Why can't I just press this? So this is what the ColourPop Yes Please palette looks like. So it is a really pretty, like, warm toned, colorful palette. And I've added this palette to my cart a bunch of times when I'm on ColourPop's website. But then I keep on convincing myself that I don't need it. Again, I have these shades in my Visor palette. I have these shades in my Naked Heat palette. I have Sugar Pill eyeshadows that are these colors that basically, if you take out the yellow and the red, it's pretty much another neutral toned palette. I just feel like those two really make it pop. I know that this was a super popular ColourPop palette. It was like the most popular ColourPop palette when it came out. And it was basically, people were saying that it was a dupe for the Natasha Denona Sunset palette. But then like a lot of people did videos on it. And they said that they really weren't dupes. But I really thought that this would be a beautiful palette for the summertime, and I kind of convinced myself to get this palette over the Natasha Denona, and I was like, I'm going to get this one. But since I have 3 ColourPop palettes in my collection already, and I have single shadows from ColourPop, I have Kathleen Light's Dream Street, Zodiac, and I have the Disney palette, and the Disney palette was the one that I wanted to get the most. ever since Kathleen Light's released Dream Street. The ColourPop color schemes are amazing. I've been interested in so many other palettes, but this was the one that I really wanted to cover. Because I had Dream Street and I have the Disney palette. Those are beautiful neutral palettes. The Disney palette is stunning. I'm so happy I picked up that palette. I was really happy with picking that up because I love Disney, so obviously I needed to pick it up. But every time I look at this, I convince myself that I didn't need it, so that's why I ended up never picking that up. There is also a part 2 of the Disney palettes coming out. Let me see if I can pull up a picture of it. I'm probably not going to get it since I love the Disney palette. And I think that the color scheme didn't really interest me. Oh, dang. Oh, right, that's just a lipstick. So Trend Mood posted a preview of the collection. If I could find a picture of it, because there's not really an official picture of it yet. Where is it? Oh, it's right here. So it was like a little ad that was, I believe, in the Ulta flyer. And it's called the Misunderstood Disney Villains Palette. So it's kind of inspired by the 6 Disney villains that were, well, actually, they have different Disney villains. They have Maleficent, they have the Evil Queen, they have Shadow Man, they have, I can't really see what the other villains are. I believe Ursula, Cruella, and looks like Hades, maybe? I don't know, but this is what the palette looks like. And it does look like a really beautiful palette, but again, I mean, like, the collector in me really wants it because it does look really pretty. And since it's a Disney Villains palette, it's like, oh my god, I want it. But I probably wouldn't pick this up until the summertime if I do decide to pick up another palette. So this would be the only palette that I would want to get besides the Soft Glam. But again, it's just like, I was going through all my palettes recently, and it's just like, I have so many. That's why the only reason why I'm justifying myself to get the Soft Glam is to replace the Modern Renaissance. So this one, again, is very, very pretty, and there are really beautiful colors in this palette, and it's not like a random selection of colors. Like, ColourPop is amazing with their color stories. They really do an amazing job of not just throwing random shades together. So I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence about this one. I probably need to get more info about this palette first before I actually do pick it up because I need to see more pictures of it and swatches. But it is a palette I am interested in. So, the next 2 palettes were probably the ones I was the most interested in besides the Natasha Denona Sunset palette. So the first palette is by Makeup Menagerie. And this is the Makeup Menagerie Feral palette. And the only reason why I was going to pick up this palette was because of the Fancy Face. She like keeps on talking about it. I think that's a better picture of it. So that's what it looks like. And I really wanted to get the first palette as well, but this one was definitely the one I was the most interested in because I felt like these colors were a little bit more wearable. But there is like, this is what the 2 palettes look like side by side. This is the Feral palette, and this is the first one. The first one, I believe, is the Dragon palette. Right? What is it called? Dragon Child. So this is the Dragon Child palette. But when I was actually looking at them, I mean, they are stunning, beautiful matte shades that are in these palettes. And these probably would be the colorful palettes that I would be the most interested in trying because I've never tried Makeup Monster's eyeshadows. I only have their liquid lipsticks, so I have no idea how their palettes perform. Those are the 2 palettes side by side. So this is the Dragon Child, a little bit more close up, and this one is the Feral. and they look stunning. Like, there's such beautiful matte shades in here, but the only reason why I would pick up these palettes was because of the beautiful, stunning, colorful mattes. And yes, I do use colorful mattes a lot more than probably colorful shimmers because I do need to use them when I use color. But again, I just was kind of convincing myself that I don't need these because I already have Sugar Pill eyeshadows that are these colors, but they don't perform as well probably that these ones do because I've heard amazing things about these palettes. But again, I just wouldn't wear these enough. Like, as I'm getting older, I'm not wearing color as much, and I know that I'm going to be wearing neutrals a hell of a lot more. That it's like, I don't really need these palettes, so I kind of just said no. I think that these palettes are different enough. Like, there's a whole row of neutrals, and then the rest are all colors, so I don't think if you take out certain shades, it's just another typical palette. Like, if you take out the 6 colorful shades in this palette, yes, it might be just another typical palette, but I think the palette is different enough to justify getting it at some point, but I don't think I'm going to get it anytime soon. Maybe I'll get it, like, next summer or something, or this summer. I'm not sure yet, but probably not. So the palette that I was the most interested in getting was the Milani Pure Passion palette, and I want to talk about that palette definitely because, I haven't really tried a Milani eyeshadow palette. I'm not really the biggest fan of drugstore eyeshadow palettes, to be honest. I don't really have a holy grail drugstore eyeshadow palette. I have a few drugstore palettes in my collection, but none of them are my absolute favorites. But I've heard amazing things about the Milani palette, so this is the Pure Passion palette. And this one would definitely be the one that I would be the most interested in, and I'm still kind of interested to pick this up because I feel like this one and the palette that I most recently got wouldn't be too difficult for me to wear or use or test out this month because there's not too many shades in the palettes. Like, there's only 12 shades in this palette, and the palette that I just got, there's only 9. So there's only about 5 lid shades, and then the rest are mattes, which I would probably use every single time I use the palette. I'm starting to get real thirsty. So yes, I would be interested in picking that up because I've only tried Milani's single shadows before, and I was never impressed with them. They were some of the first eyeshadows that I picked up from the drugstore that I've ever tried. 'Cause I never tried drugstore eyeshadows before that, so that was like around when, like, 5 years ago at least, but I decluttered those and I was never really too impressed with them, so I have not tried a Milani eyeshadow since then, so I was really interested in picking up this palette because, like, I don't love the e.l.f. palette. I don't love the Wet n Wild one. It's just like I've never really fallen in love with a drugstore palette that I feel like I would love that palette, but again, why do I need it? Like, I don't really need it. I forgot to cover this palette when I was talking about Too Faced, so let's talk about it now. So the last Too Faced palette that I wanted to cover is the infamous Too Faced Nikkie Tutorials eyeshadow palette. This was the palette that I really wanted to get. If I could even find a picture. So this is what the Nikkie Tutorials palette looks like. So it was a palette with 9 eyeshadows in it. It had it had some really pretty shades in it. So it had 9 eyeshadows, 2 blushes, a highlight, and a bronzer. So bronzer is Chocolate Soleil, which is a typical bronzer that they put in a lot of their palettes. I've actually never tried Chocolate Soleil. I've been wanting to try it for such a long time, but I haven't found it at Marshall's yet for me to get it, because that would be the only reason why I would possibly try it, is to go get it at Marshall's for a cheaper price. But I've never found it there. And then Champagne Truffle is just a full size of the color that's in the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette. It was just a full size version of that, which was kind of underwhelming for people because, like, Nikkie Tutorials is like the queen of glow, and people actually thought she would have like a blinding highlight in this palette. And then the swatches for this palette compared to the swatches that people were swatching in their own videos compared to the ones that she swatched were not even measuring up to the swatches that she posted. So that was kind of the whole thing about Too Faced. And she recently did come out about her feelings about this palette last year. She probably wasn't under contract with them anymore, that she could actually finally speak about it. She said that she felt that she was taken advantage of at the time. She didn't get paid enough money. So there was a lot of controversy about this palette. Everyone was super excited to get it. I was even really excited to get this palette because I loved Nikki Tutorials and I wanted to support her. But then I just decided to get her Ofra highlighters, and those are fucking stunning. And I love the Maybelline one as well. So I have two highlighters from her, and I'm so glad that I picked those up instead of this palette, because in the end, again, I probably wouldn't use this palette enough. I probably would have when I first got it, but I own both of these blushes in a full size, and I have like these other two in other palettes that that already eliminates this whole part of the palette, that I would only get this for the eyeshadows, and they all go together very well, but again, just the palette was not performing as well as people thought it would, and it was just a hot mess. That was like the big controversy or controversial palette before Subculture. Okay, 3 more palettes. We got 3 more palettes to talk about. So the next brand I wanted to talk about is Winky Lux. And I'm not just talking about a specific palette. I think the one I was the most interested in was the coffee palette. Yeah, I think I wanted to get this one. So this is like the neutral palette that they have. And I really wanted to try their eyeshadow. So this is the coffee palette. And I almost did actually pick this up last August during my birthday, because I went to the city with my boyfriend and my sister met up with us. And we decided to go to this store around the corner from where we were going. And they had a Winky Lux in the city. So I was able to actually look at the palettes in person, swatch them, and my boyfriend was willing to buy me one of the palettes for my birthday. Because they're only 25 bucks, so it's not like they're expensive, and they're 9 eyeshadows, so it's a pretty good price. So, but then I was like, you know what, I don't really need it. It's just another neutral palette. Like, I don't need more neutral palettes in my collection, but I am very interested in trying out the brand for their formula. So if there's another eyeshadow palette that you recommend to me from the brand, please let me know. Please let me know if you tried the brand. I really would be interested in hearing your guys' thoughts on that, because I am really interested in trying one of their palettes. Oh wow, this one's only $15. So this is the Cashmere Kitten palette, and I feel like this one's a lot more interesting to try, but it would only be because of the purple. Like, when I actually look at palettes now, I'm super picky about what they look like, and I feel like if I take out one shade, I'm not half as interested in the palette, because again, when you take out one shade, it's just another neutral palette. Like, a lot of neutral palettes add pop factors to them to make them more interesting and appealing to you, because that's what eyeshadow palettes do and what companies do to make you buy the palette. So this one is a lot more interesting to me, but again, like, I'm not sure how much use I would get out of it. So that is the Winky Lux palettes. Okay, so now we're just going to talk about 2 more palettes, and then we can finally stop talking, because I'm really getting annoyed talking now. So the other palette I wanted to talk about was, well, I want to talk about both of these palettes. So I'm going to talk about 2 Juvia's Place palettes. This is the Nubian palette. I'm just going to show you that really quick. And then I'm also going to show you guys the Nubian 2. So when I was ordering from Juvia's Place, I was really interested in getting at least one like palette that had some color in it. So I kind of eliminated the Nubian palette because I was like, it's too neutral for me. But these neutrals probably would have been a lot better for my skin tone now that I'm looking back on it. I probably should have picked this palette over the Masquerade Mini palette, because I probably would have gotten the most use out of this one. But I had seen and heard that Juvia's Place was really known for their colorful eyeshadow, so I was kind of interested in the Nubian 2, and I kind of wanted the Nubian 2 because this was Stephanie Nicole's favorite palette. When she talked about the brand, she said that this one was her favorite. But again, there's only like 2 colorful shades in here, and basically the rest of the the palette is a warm neutral palette. So I felt like that wasn't different enough for me, so I ended up getting the Masquerade mini palette. And when I actually look back at it, I really wish I would have waited until the Magic palette was released, because I feel like the Magic palette is so beautiful and unique. Sorry, I'm like starting to cough a little bit. It is so stunning, and there's just such beautiful shimmer shades in this palette. I feel like I would have used it a lot more, but at the same time, there's a lot of dark blues in this palette that I probably wouldn't have used it as much as the Masquerade Mini, because the Masquerade Mini is one of my favorite summer palettes. The colorful shades are beautiful in the palette. The matte shades are so difficult to blend. So once I got the Masquerade Mini palette, I was kind of done with Juvia's Place eyeshadows, because I just feel like the matte eyeshadows are so difficult to blend. The shimmer shades are stunning. I love the shimmer shades. They're unreal how beautiful they are. But out of that whole palette, there's only about 6 or 7 shades that I love in that palette. At least the palette wasn't too expensive, and I do use it when I do pink looks or blue looks. So I'm kind of glad that I got that palette over the other one. But I'm kind of done with eyeshadow palettes from Juvia's Place, because I don't think they're as good as people say that they are, because the mattes, obviously the mattes are going to be the eyeshadows that I use the most in that palette, in an eyeshadow palette. But every time I use that palette, I don't want to use those mattes, and I counteract these shimmers in that palette with different eyeshadow palettes from those mattes, because those mattes just don't perform. So the last palette I have to mention is from Violet Voss. And the palette that I wanted to get, I didn't want the giant palette. I think the one I wanted to get was the mini palette. Isn't there a mini version of this palette? Okay, well, I was interested in getting the Holy Grail palette originally from Violet Voss. So this is the, okay, there's like fun-sized versions, I guess. But I want to look at the Holy Grail palette. So this is the Holy Grail palette. So I was like, oh, this is really pretty. They also were like promoting this for the weekly WOW for a while, and it was on promo for quite a while. So I was like, oh, it's a really good price. But again, when I kept on looking at it, I'm like, this is just another neutral warm tone palette that I have a million of. And after the whole like Twitter rant that Violet Voss went on, I was kind of really turned off by the brand after that. So I still have never picked up anything from Violet Voss. But this palette was a lot of people's favorite palette when it came out. But when I look at it, again, it's just an oversized neutral palette that I have all of these shades in my collection anyway. Why would I need this palette? So I kind of convinced myself that I just didn't need it. I was finally able to swatch Violet Voss eyeshadows in store from Sephora, because they do sometimes carry a couple of Violet Voss palettes in store. But I feel like I would rather pick up like a smaller palette from Violet Voss, like this Creme Brulee palette, which is right here. This smaller palette, because I feel like this would be not as overwhelming, but again, I'm just not really interested in the brand because of the whole thing that happened on Instagram. And yeah, that is pretty much it, you guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. This was such a fun video to film, and you guys know how much I love eyeshadows, so I kind of wanted to cover eyeshadow palettes that I almost bought, that I would have had like 20 more plus palettes in my collection if I decided to get these palettes, but I decided not to, and I'm really proud of myself that I convinced myself that I didn't need these palettes, because you really have to be picky in makeup. There are so many palettes that are in my makeup graveyard that I just don't use anymore, and I'm kind of more proud of myself to not have such not enough self-control to pick up palettes in the past. I'm a lot happier now with my collection that I'm able to use more of my palettes that I don't use as often, because I have used like at least 40 palettes this year. It's not like I don't use my eyeshadow palettes, it's just that I'm trying to be more selective in what I get, and I want to be more selective. And what is going on with this foundation over here? But yeah, that is pretty much it, you guys. So please let me know what your favorite palettes are. Have you tried any of these palettes? Which one is your favorite out of the ones that I mentioned? Which one is the one that you think I should get? Only pick one though. I don't need more than one. But I think the one I'm going to get is the Soft Glam by Anastasia. So I love you guys. Please like and subscribe. Follow me on all my social media. I am going to also post a palettes that, what was the other one I was going to do? I don't remember. I probably have to think about that later. I love you guys. Please like and subscribe. Follow me on all my social media. I probably just said that. So bye.